Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we are joined by Innovative Programs Consultant with the Kentucky Department of Education, Rob Collins. Rob brings a wealth of experience to our conversation, both as a former English teacher and now as Innovative Programs Consultant. In his role, he's been instrumental in leading initiatives that foster creativity and progress in education, including the Kentucky Innovative Learning Network and the Kentucky Innovative Teacher Fellowship. As a doctoral candidate, Rob is diving into asset-based community development across Eastern Kentucky, using participatory action research to uncover new insights. His work reflects a deep-seated belief that education is a powerful catalyst for personal growth and community enrichment. Throughout our discussion, we explore Rob's perspective on how educators can create richer, bolder learning experiences that go beyond traditional classroom and grading models. We learn about the amazing work taking place across Kentucky to promote deeper learning and how Kentucky's portrait of a learner is changing the landscape within its schools. We chat about innovative approaches to fostering joy in the classroom and how these methods can lead to more meaningful educational outcomes. Now, to my conversation with Rob Collins. Rob, so amazing to have you on today's show. Thank you for spending some time with us. I'm really excited about the conversation, talking all about deeper learning and some of the amazing things that you are doing with the Kentucky Department of Education. But first, we got to hear from you. Rob, how you feeling? How have things been going for you for the last couple of weeks?
Yeah. Hey, Jordan, I'm delighted to be here, genuinely excited for our conversation. And I'm doing well. Things have been incredibly busy in Kentucky, but it's all good trouble. It's all good work. So busy, but excited and happy to see the progress.
Happy to see the progress. I love that. That's kind of where we're starting today's conversation, because a lot of it is going to be around some really innovative work that you and your team are doing to move forward with Kentucky's system and the portrait of a learner and all these amazing concepts. But before we get into any of that, Rob, can you just share with us a little bit about your background in education and the journey to, how did you get to the department?
Yeah, right. So my journey in education, I'm a former teacher. I was an English teacher at the high school level for 7 years. I come from a family of educators. My mom is a teacher, and she's the coolest person on the planet. I've always loved education and learning and talking about ideas, which is why I became an English teacher. But throughout my career as an English teacher, I've got interested in more community-based assignments for my students and project-based learning, which led me to being interested in innovation. And in the time I was teaching in Kentucky was very tumultuous politically. So I got involved in education advocacy and did some leadership fellowships. And one day, as I was looking in that world, I found a posting for the Division of Innovation at the Kentucky Department of Education. I thought, wow, that sounds like a cool job. So I applied, I interviewed, and it has been the best job on the planet. I say that without irony, that I really do have the greatest job, with the exception that I don't see students every day anymore. That's the one caveat. But other than that, we're the sandbox kids. It's a great place to be.
I love, and a big shout out here to Mrs. Collins for allowing Rob to foster his love of education. And for all the listeners that are out there, if you haven't called your mom yet today, now's a really good time to just pause for 30 seconds, call your mom, tell her you love her. But Rob, as you found out about the Division of Innovative Learning, first and foremost, kind of what is the Division of Innovative Learning? And can you just talk to us a little bit about some of the work you guys are doing?
Yeah, so that's a big question. So I'll say the spark notes of what we do. I say our little tagline is we spark and sustain innovation in the Commonwealth. And essentially our big umbrellas that we've been doing that is we're really building capacity in personalized learning, competency-based ed, structures that support personalized competency-based education. And we do that through a ton of different programs and initiatives. We have the Kentucky Innovative Learning Network, which I'll talk about later. We have work around local accountability, which we call our local laboratories of learning. We had a huge partnership based on project-based learning. We're doing micro-credentialing with math classes and Algebra 1. And we also do NTI in our camp. And we have legislation for divisions of innovation. We do a ton of stuff, but it's all based around improving the student experience and including diverse communities to co-create the future of education.
It's going to come out in our conversation, and I know that a lot of the work you guys are doing focuses on the community. And, we just can't stress enough as folks listen to today's conversation, but all conversations as part of this series, is how pivotal the community aspect is. And it comes out in every conversation, involving that community. And I think you guys are in a really interesting position where you get to engage a really large community of educators. But Rob, I know that you're doing a lot of work with the Innovative Learning Network. So just talk to us a little bit. What is the Innovative Learning Network?
So the Innovative Learning Network, or the KYILN, it's a professional learning network of our most forward-thinking leaders and districts. So our membership ranges around 40 districts in Kentucky out of 171. And these are folks that have really bought into our mission of learner-centered education, personalized competency-based ed, et cetera. But essentially, the goal is we come together to be a sounding board for these professionals and these forward-thinking leaders. We include national partners, of course, to offer professional learning. And our goal is to start the year planning how can we advance learner-centered education, supporting our districts and giving them space to collaborate with one another. And then at the end of the year, every year, 2 years in a row, we've done an exhibition of learning where we brought our district leaders to experience that almost defensive learning structure that our students are now experiencing. And it's just been a great space to share the work and to commiserate with others doing similar passion projects in the state. It's really about building that professional efficacy in leaders.
And from your experience getting to work with these 40 innovative districts, how is it, this work that you guys are doing helping to sort of shape broader policy or approaches to education in Kentucky?
Yeah, I think so. So just, writ large, there's a lot more attention on what are these innovations that are happening. So, of course, Portrait of a Learner is a huge initiative at the moment. But there are more people in the space and considering, okay, what happens if we shift the learning experience to be learner-centered and not that traditional, 100-year-old model that we've been using. And the ILN also is an umbrella for projects like the local laboratories of learning, which really are tackling that question of local assessment and accountability. And in Kentucky, so we have, I'd be remiss not to mention this, we have a large umbrella vision that was co-created by our communities with our previous commissioner, Dr. Jason Glass, called the Kentucky United We Learn Vision. And under that vision, we synthesized from communities across the state 3 big ideas that they want for the future of education in Kentucky. Vibrant learning experiences for every student, innovation, especially in the area of assessment, and then collaboration with communities. And from that, we convened a council, the Kentucky United We Learn Council, whose goal is to launch a new assessment and accountability system. And that work is happening or began in that Kentucky Innovative Learning Network and in that local laboratories of learning space. And now it's spread statewide. It's really big, impressive, and ambitious work. And happy to be a part of it. I don't know that I answered the question, but that's
Well, I think when we're talking about concepts that are as big as this, it's really hard to just route it down to a single statement or phrase to encapsulate that. But, you've talked a lot about accountability. You've spoke so far, about innovation around assessment. And we're definitely going to circle back on that because it's a big challenge that a lot of school districts are facing when they're bringing these new initiatives in. But before we do get to that accountability factor, I would love to dive into this concept of deeper learning, because I think it really puts the foundation for all what we're going to talk about today. And, when I was out with districts in Kentucky last week, even this idea of deeper learning just came up time and time again. We're innovating on deeper learning. So, in your own words, Rob, like, what is deeper learning, and what does this mean in the context of the education system in Kentucky?
Yeah. So in my own words, deeper learning, I think in its most technical sense, it's the ability to take knowledge and skills and dispositions and transfer them to an authentic context. So let's say you learn a specific math concept in geometry and measuring angles and calculating angles, right? I think deeper learning would be taking that content and that context and applying it to, say, I don't know, maybe you're building a flower box for outside your home, right? So for me, it's that transfer of skill and applying it in a context that may be academic, but may not be academic. And I think that's the technical definition. If I were considering what does deeper learning mean in a more human sense, it's just education that matters, specifically to students, that what they are learning from us empowers them to be effective citizens and thinkers and human beings.
And I just love the idea of, making this real world. How many times are our students sitting down at dinner and, what did you learn at school today? Oh, I don't know. And then when you finally do get something and the student goes, why do I need to learn this? Because I'm never going to use it. And I can think back to my own education experiences of things that, I know that I probably haven't applied, and I can remember having those thoughts and having that conversation with my math teacher of, why am I learning how to measure this angle when I like to write history essays?
Yeah.
Right. That sort of dialogue. So I love that you're embedding this narrative into the system of, it's about, yes, you need to learn the knowledge and the skills, but how do you apply it? And I think that's a really important consideration when we think about how this is going to differ learning approaches. So from your lens, coming from, what I assume, Rob, was more of a traditional education classroom when you were an English teacher, how are you seeing the learning model shift from a traditional approach with deeper learning kind of being rooted in the narrative?
Yeah. Before I talk about that shift I've experienced, I wanted to piggyback on the idea you just mentioned of having that conversation with yourself of, why am I learning this? And of course, I can think of myself having that conversation many times. But now as an adult, I see myself more often saying, when I need some math skill that I've long since lost, thinking, I know I learned this at one point, right?
Right.
And I imagine, how could I have had an experience in school that would have allowed me to remember that skill? Yeah. I would assume it would be through deeper learning and that transfer of the skill, right? Which is why I think deeper learning is so important. And yes, I had a traditional schooling experience, except for those moments when my friends and I were creative and we made projects for ourselves, right?
Right.
But I'm thinking the pedagogy around that needs to change, that teachers feel empowered to make those calls with their teaching. But also just a culture of, let's bring community in, let's solve problems in our communities, and let's ensure what our students are learning isn't just for the sake of rote memorization and acing a test. It's for applicability to that student's life. And I think that would be my framing. Yeah.
And I'm curious, for a teacher who is listening and thinking, okay, I really understand, like, the idea of deeper learning is enticing to me. I really want this to be a part of my practice. How could somebody kind of get started?
Yeah, so I think in Kentucky, because we've done so much groundwork, we had a deeper learning grant for the past 2 years. I think it's ending in September. But there has just been so much momentum around deeper learning. In fact, we just had a statewide conference called Momentum on deeper learning. But I think in Kentucky, it's as simple as reaching out to your regional educational cooperative. We have 8 of them in the state. Most of them have deeper learning teams, deeper learning specialists. And also our team, we recently added 4 regional innovation specialists. So reaching out to those resources, because I think there's a real appetite to change the way or the systems that folks are teaching in, not necessarily the way folks are teaching in the purest sense, because I think there's a lot of deeper learning happening, but it's really lifting the cage of worrying about some of our assessment concerns that maybe really aren't learner focused. So in Kentucky, it's as simple as who's my co-op? Can I email Rob Collins? And the answer is yes, you may. I'd love to.
Well, and I think it's an important call out, Rob, that you just mentioned is likely deeper learning is happening, but maybe a teacher doesn't know to name it, that they're going through a deeper learning convention. And it's just a matter of some of that awareness. And for our listeners who are not within Kentucky, every state has cooperatives that are supporting your school districts that you can reach out to, or reach out to the leaders that are there to find some of these resources, because they are there. And it's just a matter of being connected with the person who can lead you to that area. Where I'm really beginning to get some curiosity here, Rob, is you mentioned a bit ago Kentucky and the Portrait of a Learner, and obviously and the state has done some amazing work on the Portrait of a Learner. So how does deeper learning now connect to that Portrait of a Learner? And, feel free to take a step back if you want to just explain first off, what is the Portrait of a Learner, and then where does deeper learning come in?
Yeah, so I think if I was just to describe Portrait of a Learner, it's typically a set of agreed on skills or dispositions, competencies, or typically what we call them, that a community values in its students. So these are things like empowered learner, critical thinker, effective communicator, those sorts of skills and dispositions. And really, it's typically adjective and then noun is the way it's structured. At any rate, that Portrait of a Learner is a way of saying this is what we want to enable in our students, or allow them to, these are the skills we wish for them to grow. And in Kentucky, we do have a statewide portrait, but I don't want listeners to think that is the state imposing this portrait on our district. Right. In fact, at the moment, at last count, we have 120 districts out of 171 that have developed portraits, and that's anywhere along a continuum from they're just starting to they've had one for years. But it's important to note that these portraits at that district level are developed by those local communities. Right. So it really is that co-creation with the people in that community, the parents of those children, the community leaders, having a conversation and saying, these are the things we want to instill in our students, and the skills we want to enable them to use in their adult life. And the role of the state, I think, has been to build capacity there and support structures that enable Portrait of a Learner. So things like innovative assessments and performance assessments, defenses of learning structures, exhibitions of learning. These are all structures that support that overall portrait frame.
We will circle back on some of these structures, the defense and the exhibition and the assessments, because I want to make sure we're going to hit on each one. They're very unique, but are really important strategies for any district implementing a Portrait of a Learner or a Portrait of a Graduate to consider. But a little bit ago, Rob, you were mentioning how with the shift to deeper learning, it's really going to begin to empower teachers to involve the community to help solve problems that are not just in the building, but in the community as a whole. And I would love to just pick your brain a little bit to see, how, or if you have any examples of what districts might be doing to help, solve some challenges in their community, and kind of how this is fostering a better school community as a whole.
Yeah, so I think the involvement of community, specifically in classrooms, probably happens most easily, at least at this moment, through project-based learning, really high-quality project-based learning. I, as part of the Kentucky Innovative Learning Network, I also manage an Innovative Teacher Fellowship. And part of that project is teachers involving community members. And I think the easiest way to get that started is on that classroom level, and also through administrators in the school, but connecting with community members so that it isn't a surprise when, a 7th grade science teacher reaches out to the local conservatory and says, hey, can we partner up and talk a little bit about your content in the context of our community? I think a lot of the hurdle right now is that connection isn't established and folks aren't used to a teacher reaching out to them and saying, hey, let's.
Right.
Some places are, and it's thriving and it's beautiful. Other places are, is this spam, right? That might be the first interaction that folks have had with the education system in a long time. And I think breaking that mold a little bit, and it's capacity building not only on the part of a school, but also community members, letting them know, hey, this is a reciprocal relationship.
I think it's a really interesting idea of reaching out to the community. And, we hear this trend pretty often of, so you can start small, but dream big. And I think, bringing it to that classroom level is a really good call out to say, hey, you are a teacher, you have 30 students with you. In your understanding of those 30 students, you're going to probably get a really good understanding of what their interests are and how can you make that connect to real life. So, an example that we hear all the time is having a classroom lead a, schoolyard cleanup or do a recycling drive or helping to build a community garden and partnering with a local business to help do the community gardening aspects. So, I love that. That's kind of where a good starting place comes from. But what I'm curious about to kind of transition the conversation is, we're talking about a larger concept and a larger system shift. Portrait of a learner is not something that happens overnight. And we know that it takes time to make this shift and change the culture of the district to support it. We also hear a lot of, misconceptions about what is the portrait of a learner and why are we doing this. So, Rob, what are some misconceptions that you're kind of hearing about deeper learning or hearing about the portrait of a learner? And we're going to use this as a platform to begin to squash some of those misconceptions and how we can overcome them.
Yeah, I think the largest misconception is the effort it takes to implement a portrait of a learner or to implement really robust, deeper learning. One is impossible in the current system, which there may be something to that argument. Which is why we're working to change it. But 2 is just too intensive of time and human resources. And I think that's the largest thing I hear, especially given the current state of teacher recruitment and retention and attrition. Folks are just really worried, like, I cannot add another thing to my plate,
right? Which
is a legitimate concern. It comes from a place of legitimacy, though I think it's framing what a portrait is and what this change is wrongly. So I can elaborate on that if you'd like.
I'm always open to elaboration.
Okay. So I think, and I hold this pretty deeply, that there is transformative power in reimagining the school experience and breaking the shackles of those traditional structures that we all put in our classroom. And I really think there's something life-giving about, a really great project-based learning experience where your student decides what they're doing and partners with community to make it happen. In that way, I think those structures actually make the job easier because it's so fulfilling. And if you're a missional person, teaching really is an amazing career and way to make an impact. And I think that these structures they need not be imposed in the same way traditional testing has felt for the past, couple of decades. Instead, they are an overlay that honors the work that happens and really celebrates it versus being used for the purposes of, being punitive for bad test scores. Right? That's not what this is.
And I think, as we are thinking about that role of the teacher, their role begins to shift a little bit in the classroom, and they can get back to being really creative and allowing their student to take agency in their learning, which I think is something that is going to empower not only the teacher, but obviously that student themselves to do some really cool work. And as somebody who went through an education system that was very traditional, and I can tell you about the test anxiety, the red ink on the essay, the shoving in the back of the desk, never looking at it again and not listening to any feedback. Like, those are not memorable education experiences. But what you're explaining and talking about is an opportunity to really bring life to the classroom and help students to have really memorable experiences.
Yeah, it's I'm going to latch onto the red ink on the essay as a former English teacher and someone who loves writing. The experience of assessment for students right now in most spaces is one of anxiety and one of, wow, if I get a poor grade, that just reaffirms that, I don't have that skill and I best, move on as quickly as possible. When really in, talking about defenses of learning and those types of structures, the point of that type of feedback is to continually improve your work. And it's that reciprocal relationship between student and teacher that really is affirming and helps one to grow. So I think, traditional assessment structures create that anxiety and have totally misappropriated the spirit of feedback and that relationship between teacher and student.
And you've spoken a lot today about part of the division of innovation is to help innovate on assessment of learning. So can you talk to us a little bit about what's some of these innovations are looking like? How are you beginning to shift that narrative to better support the student when it comes to measuring that growth over time?
Yeah, so I've said it a lot, defenses of learning. I think that's been tied in with Portrait of a Learner. Defense structures and exhibition structures have been our most concerted effort to rethink that assessment piece, because it really does privilege not only students exhibiting their skills and their passions through a body of work, but also because it privileges that reciprocal connection between adults, whether it be parents, teachers, community members, and the student. And the way we're doing that work is, one, supporting portrait work. And the state has been involved in developing guidance on developing indicators and performance outcomes for Portrait of a Learner competencies. And I think that's probably our biggest state policy leverage point.
Right.
So that's been our most impactful work and probably most meaningful.
And just to dive into that defensive learning structure, I've heard it called different things, the exhibition, the defense, the demonstration of learning. Can you just help us understand, what does that look like? I'm a student and I am asked to do a defensive learning. Like, what does that mean to me?
Sure. I do want to say I think exhibition and defense / presentation are distinct things. When I think an exhibition of learning, I really do think that more kind of science fair, everyone in the gymnasium with richer structures, of course, not just the trifold board. No, there's nothing wrong with a good trifold board. So I think exhibitions are a little different in that way. But I consider defensive learning where a student builds a body of work to demonstrate that they've developed a competency. Let's say, for example, I have a student that is defending their attainment of empowered learner, for example. And the structure would be in concert with or in collaboration with their teacher. A student would build a body of evidence, a portfolio of work, and then share that work with a panel of adults and peers too, I think is actually a great addition. So we're thinking teachers, perhaps their parents come in, perhaps a community member comes in that's, germane to the content area. And essentially it's that structure of saying, here's what I've learned, here's how I embody this competency. And it's a discussion. And some people clamor a little bit about the notion of defense versus presentation. I think I'm a contrarian at heart, so I like the idea of defending your work. But I take the point. But essentially that's the structure.
And that's where we see, the idea of what you're going to call these initiatives, like a demonstration of learning. I've heard by multiple school districts, because they say that, hey, they don't want their student to feel the pressure that I have to stand and defend. I'm going to just demonstrate, and it's a little bit more inclusive in that, which is the same reason why, Kentucky leverages the portrait of a learner as a vernacular instead of the graduate, because this is not about just the high school student, it's about the K-12 student and their whole education career. So, that language that's used will look different dependent on the region that you're in. But Rob, before we kind of keep moving forward here about some integration strategies into the classrooms, I would want to give you the opportunity. You said there's a difference of the presentation and the exhibition. So can you just talk to us about, what's that exhibition look like? You got the gymnasium, students have their opportunity to showcase what the learning is that they're doing, but you mentioned structures in place. So just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think the way I've seen some successful exhibitions happen, and I think celebration is also a really good word in place of exhibition, but it's about bringing community in to see the learning. So a teacher we had last year in our innovative teacher cohort, actually, I think 2 out of the 10 had exhibitions. At any rate, the idea was the parents came in to the school and they were given kind of a protocol for approaching students and discussing their work. And this was a project-based learning unit that was being shared. So there was a guiding question, a driving question that students had researched in their specific areas. And essentially it was just parents come in and see what the learning is about. But the thing that's different from that typical science fair is that protocol that really guides, here's the things you might ask of the student and facilitate that conversation about what they've learned, how that learning connected to the community. One of those teachers I mentioned, her name was Nikki Jolly. Their unit was about their county that they lived in and the history of the county. So it was really cool to see some senior community members coming in and not only learning from the students what they learned about, say, the sulfur wells in the county, but also sharing that information back and forth. It's just really rich in a way that I think the way we typically think of those things, it isn't necessarily.
Well, and it's really cool because you can allow the student to have a platform to celebrate what they are passionate about.
Yeah.
And I was, just to build on those examples, I was at a conference where some folks from Frankfurt Independent School had their students come and present about their portrait of a learner. And what those students did is they talked through their entire project, and they ended up leveraging 3D printing technology to create miniature models of the historic buildings around the state. And it started off in that lens, and then they ended up creating a business to sell them, to fundraise for another initiative in the building. And then at the end, it was amazing because one of the audience members asked the students, so you're about to graduate. Is this where, are you going to go into fabrication? He's like, no, not at all. And it was kind of this really funny moment, but that's the beautiful thing is the student went through this and took amazing takeaways, but realized this is not what I want for the rest of my life. And there's something beautiful to be said about that, but it was through a school-based experience like that they would never have had otherwise. And I think that's just, whether it's a defense, a demonstration, a celebration, a showcase, like you're talking through these experiences that students are able to really celebrate.
Yeah. And I think the key there for me is that the student becomes an authority on some type of body of work, which when you think of children and teenagers, so rarely do our students feel empowered to be an authority on something. But when you give them that really rich opportunity to study something deeply and to craft a presentation, they have more knowledge than anyone in the room at that point, right?
Right.
And in the case I mentioned where the community members came in and talked about the community, there's an authorship there where the student becomes not just a bystander in the community, but a part of it and a knowledge maker of the community. And I just think that's a rethinking of the whole like civic relationship too.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious because we're talking about, these students being empowered, doing this amazing work, but we think about the classroom structure, and at some point, educators do need to help students understand what these competencies are and how they can actually develop these competencies. And there's a lot of different ways this can happen, but a challenge school teams face a lot is, as you've mentioned, Rob, I don't have enough time to make this happen. So how are you seeing districts combat that by integrating the development into their curriculum?
So I think really what's happening or should be happening in that case is just a culture of documentation, which we've very much gotten away from documentation as a positive or beneficial thing, right? It feels like paperwork. It feels like it's time consuming, but there's power in reshifting that narrative that no, when you document your work, you're creating a narrative of what you've learned and what you can do. And the same is true for educators as well. So I think it's actually a weird dichotomy. We live in a society that is so obsessed with documentation when we think of like cell phone video and TikTok and things like that. But when it comes to work that is, structured and based on competencies and standards, like we balk at that idea of documentation.
Right.
So I think the big question is how can we make that documentation seamless and a part of the learning experience where it doesn't feel onerous. So it's a hard conversation to have, and one I know that you're probably well familiar with, but that's my frame of thinking for it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting frame of thinking because I am also similar to you, very much a believer of allow the students to show and document their learning. As an educator, give timely feedback and model the development that you want them to see, and allow the student to reflect and start answering those questions. If you are asking them good questions and you're giving them good feedback, they will be able to say, hey, through this, I did exemplify how I'm communicating or growing in that area. Because a big challenge that we hear a lot right now is, those schools wanting to update lesson plans, say, hey, show me your long range guide around this unit of study. And if the competency development is not a through line, and if a student does the unit of study and they can't say, okay, this is how I exemplified this competency through the unit of study, maybe don't teach that curriculum that way. So it's kind of one of those things of, how do we support this? How does a district bring that competency development to kind of be second nature? Do they need to have long range plans built in that way? Is there another method to allow students to say, like, I'm developing these competencies?
I think so. It is a fair consideration for districts taking that long view. I understand. But I think the way we've really been supporting it, as I mentioned, is that development of outcome measurements and indicators. So those are by grade band, which I think would support it through lessons, but it's not so much a single snapshot in time saying that, through these things, they will demonstrate that competency, though that can happen. I really think it's more the development of that body of work and the development of that knowledge. So kind of worrying about, okay, how's this happening? If you have a classroom that's really entrenched in deeper learning and high quality project-based learning experiences, those competencies are developing through that work.
Right.
And often academic strengths and academic standards are also developing in that space too. I think a lot of times we want to divorce a competency from a portrait of a learner from academic standards. And these things are very intertwined in a way that it's hard to extricate them from one another, which I think is the district level tendency but it doesn't always work that way. And that's just
Right.
the messiness of being a human and a learner.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a really challenging conversation, especially when we're looking to get teachers to buy into these brand new concepts, sometimes for the very first time. And we know the realities of they're busy, they got a lot on their plate. And then you say, hey, time to do one more thing. We're going to roll out this portrait of a learner. And they say, okay, give me the resources. So I understand completely. But like you've mentioned, the effective instruction should allow the competency development to happen. And maybe it's just a matter of having it very visible for the students to say, hey, these are the competencies that we're working on, and building time for them to reflect in their classroom to actually say, this is my development of those competencies. And I think it's really easy to forget that you got to build some of that time for reflection for the student in this process as well. Yeah,
on that point, I think that's critical, that districts and policymakers recognize that it's not just about the statewide lens of have these students in aggregate achieve this goal or met this achievement or assessment measure. It's also about the individual student knowing enough of themselves to make that case for themselves and understanding themselves as a learner. That's not something that you're ever going to see demonstrated at large. That those personal stories, it's just not possible. But that it's such a key and critical point that doesn't get mentioned in these policy conversations, that I think at least entrenching deeper learning structures within a school can support that element of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as we're talking about all these things, measurements and assessment and accountability come back up. And you mentioned kind of right at the top of today's conversation that a lot of the work you're doing with the local laboratories is built around accountability. Can you just talk to us a little bit about, what is this accountability that you're referencing, and kind of what is the local laboratories working on in that area?
Yeah. So the local laboratories of learning were charged with building prototypes of local assessment and accountability, and sharing those to inform larger structural policy change at the state level. And really, we have 18 districts across 3 cohorts. And what they've done is convened inclusive, diverse local coalitions to make that decision of, here are the things we want to value in our students and to instill in our students by the time they run through our K-12 system. Typically, that starts with the development of a portrait of a learner and then implementing that type of work and competency-based ed. But essentially what we've seen is our communities value different things. And what our leaders are really tackling is, how do we tell that story of what we are doing for our students, and how do we generate the type of learning they're looking for, and that reciprocal relationship as well between community and schools. So I think we have a handful of districts that have launched a prototype that are publicly available. You can look at them, and it's really interesting to see them sharing that narrative of, okay, so maybe here are our test scores here on one piece, but also here's the ways we've engaged our community. Here are the ways that our students have learn things outside of school. Here's our, social media reach has been one, which has been interesting. But it's based on what those community members have said. Hey, these are what we want of our students. And it differs from rural communities to our more urban communities, right? There's a wide range. And the prototypes are different too, which is lovely to see how the same idea has coalesced in so many different spaces. And I do want to make a note that this all fits under the Kentucky United We Learn umbrella at the moment. That's aimed at changing Kentucky's assessment and accountability system. And we've talked a little bit about the portrait of a learner, deeper learning feeling like one more thing. In the conversations we're having, it is much more about supplanting some of those antiquated structures with these more vibrant community-built structures. So we are thinking through the question of, from a state policy lens, how do we eliminate that one more thing feeling?
Right.
But it's very much prototype phase. So it's very nascent work, but it's interesting.
And I just think so much, and a lot of leaders express that they put in the time, resources, and efforts to involve the community in building their localized portrait, and they have their competencies. But once that's done, they struggle to engage their community. They struggle to keep this from going into a static, this is the framework, go. And it has to be iterative. We know this. It has to be kind of a living process and involvement in the community. So I don't know if you have any examples of what a district or two districts are doing just to continue to communicate out with their community about their work. Are they using social media, building websites, hosting, after school events? What sort of things are folks doing?
Yeah, so in the L3 specifically, that's built into our process and our program. So the L3 lives off 4 design habits. They are co-creation, inclusion, empathy, and reciprocity. So that's baked in. We're meeting once a month every month with these communities at large as a community of practice, and talking about their prototypes and sharing across communities. And community members come to these meetings as well.
Right.
So it's not just the superintendents, the chief academic officers. It's also a business owner that runs a manufacturing business, a business owner that runs, or a faith leader, right? Like, these community members are also in this space. And in the L3s, that's happening by design, but it's also happening outside of L3 districts too. So we do have some districts who launched a portrait probably 8 years ago, and they're actually redesigning their portrait now and rethinking it. So that iterative nature of the portrait, I think a lot of our districts have already latched on to the power of that. And it's happening organically in some spaces, and it's happening by design, supported through our department.
And it kind of leads to the next curiosity is, as our system as a whole is changing, the needs of our students are changing, the needs of our communities are changing. How do you see initiatives like the Portrait of a Learner, but even perhaps more broadly, competency-based education, evolving as these educational needs continue to evolve?
Yeah, I think with an eye that these processes are iterative and that they exist to be changed when change is called for. I think just the understanding of that in the design process is critical. And I think for the most part, it's there. But then I think there's just something to be said about that ongoing conversation between community and educators and students in renegotiating what do we want to be and what do we want to create in our community, and also what challenges do we face. And I think through deeper learning, through Portrait of a Learner and competency-based ed, there's a groundswell of agency within students, which enables that to happen organically. But you must have leaders that look to make that sort of situation occur.
Right.
So leadership is incredibly important, but also I the kids are all right. And I think that in supporting their agency, we can allow that to continue to happen just naturally by building good people.
Right.
Not even building, that's not the right word. By supporting our already good students in becoming good adults and good humans and thinkers. And yeah, I have a lot of optimism about it. I just have to say that. So,
and what I just love the portrait or this community involvement so much is, as you just mentioned, communicating with the community to say what are the challenges that you have to face and how together can we solve that problem. And by doing that, you're empowering the student to take ownership in the community problems, but it's really creating a beautiful synergy between the school and the community, especially when we think about, historically speaking, tension that is around our education system. And I think this is going to really change that narrative. And I think it's doing it in a way that's incredibly impactful for our students.
Yeah, I just hearing you say that, I have to mention a little bit about the business case for this type of work too in communities. I can think of a specific story from one of our counties that's been in L3 for a while. They've implemented a pretty sophisticated defensive learning structure. And on the defense panel was a representative from the regional hospital. And that student actually got offered a job after their senior capstone defense. So I think in that way, especially engaging like business communities, there's power in recognizing that this work is meaningful for students, not just as people, but also as employees, right? Even though it's a little, students aren't just employees, but it does matter that there's economic viability in a space, right? And this enables that to happen more in a more authentic way.
Well, I just think of so much about, what is the purpose of education, and it's to help grow that individual and to help them prepare for what their future is going to look like. And if you're able to connect with members of your community, with business leaders, have them ask those real world questions, ask you how you're applying it, whether they're going to a post-secondary education or straight into the workforce, those opportunities to connect is only going to support that individual. And I think this brings that in a really great way to the kind of purpose of what we're doing with our students to help make them future ready. But Rob, I'm really curious, as you've been supporting a lot of different districts, what advice would you give to leaders who are looking to either bring this vision to implementation, or perhaps they have a vision, but they're struggling to get buy-in in their district? What advice would you give?
So those are two different things. I think on the first point, if they're really looking to build capacity and make it happen, partnering with another district that has already made some headway. That's what we've done with the Kentucky Innovative Learning Network, with the local laboratories of learning. That partnership, and not just bringing leadership, but also teachers and community members to other spaces where it's happening. That's, I think, probably the most helpful thing in getting your mind around what that structure looks like in your local context. And the buy-in piece, what I just mentioned may help visiting another community, but really, if you don't start from a space of co-creating that vision, including community members and educators in the initial discussions, it's really hard to get top-down buy-in. And I would argue it's not meaningful to start that way. It's a plastic version of what we want. So I wouldn't do that to begin with.
Right. So, from what I'm hearing, and for leaders that may be having that struggle, ask yourself that question: where was this created from? And if you feel like you can't answer that question, it might be a good opportunity to take one step back before two steps forward. Ask that question, bring in a forum of the community, and iterate and implement change to the structure that you've put in place. I think is a really good piece of advice. But Rob, to kind of wrap up our conversation here today, we talked a lot about the portrait of a learner and deeper learning. Why do you see initiatives like this as the future of K-12 education?
So that's an interesting question. And, I work in innovation, right? So it's also about being disruptive. I think for the next 10 years or so, this shift of personalizing education and really building authentic skills in students, it's it centers the student as a human being, and it centers educators as central in building that future that's rich and vibrant for a student. And I think that's why it's the best place to latch onto now, just because of the way that these initiatives are built around built around supporting students in being successful, and not about necessarily measurement or evaluation. So that's why I love the Portrait of a Learner, that the learner really comes first in just the idea of the structure, right? It's in the name. Now, I do wonder what, after districts have, say in Kentucky, we get 171 districts that have a Portrait of a Learner and are implementing them with fidelity. I do wonder what's next, especially given the proliferation of AI and and certain political climate, right? Like I hesitate to say it's the future of education in the long view, but I think it's a critical next step for a lot of folks.
And, I appreciate the sentiment of where you're coming from with that, because you're right. We don't know what the world is going to look like in 10 years. And sometimes when we make decisions as leaders, maybe we're thinking almost too far ahead, and it's important to think ahead. But 10 years from now, the needs of that individual student are going to be vastly different, which is why I love the iterative process of the Portrait of a Learner, because it is built, and you've already mentioned it, districts are 8 years in, which is pretty close to that 10, and they're now revamping, and now they're changing and adapting. And that's why I see, and I'm such a firm believer that this is the most important kind of route where our system could be moving, because of how fluid it is going to be when it comes to supporting those students and putting them in the center.
Yeah, certainly.
But all that said, really amazing to hear how we're going to collectively focus on putting the students in the center to make them successful and to empower them and their voice. Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show here today. It's been amazing getting to learn about the work that the Department of Education is doing. I know that there's lots of amazing resources online that they can find, talking through some of those local laboratories of learning, and there's lots of visibility into that. Rob, where can people go to find out about a bit of this work you guys are up to?
Yeah, so we are a state Department of Education. So, education.ky.gov. It's pretty quick Google search. If you look for innovation in Kentucky, we will pop up, and all of our initiatives will be pretty easy to find through a hyperlink. And I also talk about it quite a bit on some like LinkedIn, for example. But our state website is probably the best place to find curated resources.
Awesome. Well, Rob, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today. We appreciate every minute and all the insights that you've brought.
Yeah, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
That was Innovative Programs Consultant with the Kentucky Department of Education, Rob Collins. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. Please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.